Hi everyone, I'm Josh, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be looking at 5 great Gothic novels that I think you should read. On this channel I'll be giving you book reviews and analyses from Gothic fiction, fantasy fiction, and I'll also be looking at classics as well from time to time. To kickstart this channel, I thought a really fun thing to do would be to do a list of 5 great novels from each of these different categories. So next week I'll be putting up a video of 5 great fantasy novels, and the week after I'll do 5 great classics, and then we can start the normal reviews and analyses following that. With all that being said, let's get on with the list. First on this list we have Carmilla, written by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu in 1872. In Carmilla, we follow 18-year-old Laura as she recounts the story of the mysterious Carmilla, who stayed with her at her father's castle after being stranded due to a carriage accident. As Carmilla and Laura's friendship blossoms, other young women in the nearby town begin to die of an unknown and mysterious illness. I put Carmilla on this list because it's one of the oldest works of vampire fiction. It even predates Bram Stoker's Dracula by 26 years, and it even served as an inspiration for Dracula. Bram Stoker himself wrote a possible prequel, or possibly this was an early chapter of Dracula that was cut, people aren't sure, but he wrote this little novella called Dracula's Guest, and in that novella there is a scene which is meant to have a direct reference, which I won't say because it will spoil the plot of Carmilla to say it, but there's a direct reference in that chapter to Le Fanu's Carmilla, which is really cool. You can see the influence of Carmilla all the way through vampire fiction, from Dracula up until, say, Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. The vampire in Carmilla definitely wouldn't be out of place either in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. She shares a lot of similar characteristics to those vampires in terms of the kind of dark, brooding nature, but also the kind of sensuality and sexuality that we see, especially kind of brought to the forefront in more modern incarnations of vampires. What makes this story really worth reading, though, is the central relationship between Laura and Carmilla. It's rare in Gothic fiction, especially classic Gothic fiction, that you get a detailed relationship between two women, and this novel is purely based on a relationship between two women. Now, this relationship is interesting for a few reasons. First of all, it's incredibly complex. On the one hand, they have this kind of sisterly close bond with each other, a friendship, but then this is undercut with certain sexual undertones which are quite explicit for a book this old. In fact, I found the relationship between Carmilla and Laura so dynamic and complex that I was never really sure when I was reading it what Carmilla's true intentions for Laura were. Whether Laura was just some prey that she was kind of toying with, or whether she was actually romantically infatuated with Laura and wanted to turn her into a vampire. Now, this novel has a very short page count, so it's definitely worth, if you've not read much classic fiction, this is a good place to start. I think it comes in at just over 100 pages. Also, if you're interested in vampire fiction more generally as a subgenre, then this is definitely worth a read so that you can kind of trace the history of vampire fiction all the way back to its roots. Moving on now to my next pick, which is the only contemporary-ish pick on this list, and that is Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, written in 1979. The Bloody Chamber is a collection of Gothic reimaginings of traditional fairy tales and folk tales. These range from Bluebeard, Beauty and the Beast, Little Red Riding Hood, Snow White, and even Puss in Boots. When discussing her intentions with The Bloody Chamber, Carter stated, "My intention was not to do versions, or as the American edition of the book said, horribly adult fairy tales, but to extract the latent content from the traditional stories." Carter recognises the sometimes violent or sexual undertones of stories like Little Red Riding Hood and Beauty and the Beast, and she plays around with them and brings them to the fore. This makes for some of the most imaginative and unique reimaginings of fairy tales that I've ever come across. With some of these stories, like Beauty and the Beast and Little Red Riding Hood, she even does multiple versions of the stories, which allows her to play on variations of themes within those stories. And with Little Red specifically, there's even one story where she combines this with Alice in Wonderland to give a completely unique and original tale. One thing that Carter does really well within these retellings is that she gives depth and nuance to these female protagonists that in the original tales don't really get much in terms of character development. This is done really well in the opening The Bloody Chamber, which is the longest effort in the collection. The character begins by exploring and reflecting on her future marriage to the sadistic Count. Also, by allowing her female characters to think about topics like sex, she kind of subverts the classic purity trope that we see in these fairy tales, where the pure female character tends to be asexual or anti-sexual almost, whereas in these stories they certainly have sexual desires, even if they don't necessarily want the advances of some of the horrible men that they meet in the stories. All of the tales in this story are also just delivered with Carter's excellent prose. She has one of the most unique and interesting voices that I've ever come across. It's not necessarily for everyone. She can use maybe overly complex language at times, but I think for the most part it's witty, it's inventive, and you can just tell that she really loves language, and it's just such a joy to read, even if it can be a bit challenging at times. On now to my next pick for this list, which is Justine, or the Misfortunes of Virtue, written by the Marquis de Sade in 1791. Orphaned and penniless at the age of 12, the beautiful and devout Justine embarks upon her remarkable odyssey. Her strong-willed faith in moral purity and blind trust in the virtue of others destines her for sexual exploitation and martyrdom. Sade uses the many misfortunes of the virtuous Justine to illustrate his belief in the superiority of nature over civilization, and the idea that virtue will always fall to vice. This is probably the most difficult novel on this list. The topics that Justine covers range from the perverse to the outright immoral. In fact, this is one of few Gothic novels that has managed to sustain its reputation for controversy all the way up until the present day. However, I do think that there's more substance than smut in this novel. As the synopsis tells us, Sade is using the story of Justine to illustrate a point about morality and how we shouldn't be virtuous, because to be virtuous is to basically be a slave for everyone else and to be exploited by everyone else. Sade also uses certain narrative techniques in order to kind of soften some of the more horrifying aspects of the novel. A good example of this is the narrative voice itself. The story is told from the perspective and with the voice of Justine in first person. Justine, as a virtuous person, avoids using coarse language, so oftentimes some of the depraved things that happen get described in a very kind of whimsical and somewhat absurd way. It's almost as if your kind of prudish granny is telling you the story at times. And this can even have a sort of comedic effect, which I think is definitely a good thing in a novel that gets as dark as this novel goes. All the same, the stuff that goes on in here is still pretty terrible, and there's only so much language like that can do, but it certainly adds a certain whimsical and unreal atmosphere to the novel, which makes it feel more like a fairy tale and less like something that's happening in reality. I also find the character of Justine herself to be a very interesting one. Oftentimes when people talk about Sade, and in particular female characters in Sade, they often focus on Justine's sister character, Juliet, if they want to argue that some of Sade's women are actually quite empowered. Well, I think the argument is true, because Juliet is more autonomous and strong-willed and goes out and gets what she wants and takes no prisoners. Justine's strength is more internal. One of the things that I noticed when reading this book is that, although terrible things happen to Justine, she often chooses those terrible things to happen to her, because she doesn't want to sacrifice her moral principles. The fact that someone could actually be that strong-willed and that staunch in their principles in the face of all of the terrible things that Justine faces is actually quite, remarkable in itself. I also think that, not to go into too much of a tangent here, but that kind of undermines Sade's intellectual point that vice will always triumph. So overall then, Justine has an interesting philosophical underpinning. It has one of the most sympathetic, interesting, and maybe even sometimes frustrating heroines in Justine, and it's also just off the wall and crazy, and if you've got the stomach for it, it's definitely worth a read. Next on the list we have a novel that I just finished, and is probably one of my favourite, if not my favourite Gothic novel at the moment. This is The Monk, written by Matthew Gregory Lewis in 1796. The Monk chronicles the fall of Ambrosio, a respected superior of the Capuchins of Madrid, which begins when he succumbs to the temptations of Matilda, a young girl who enters his monastery disguised as a boy. Descending into a hell of his own creation, Ambrosio is driven to magic and murder in order to conceal his crimes from the Inquisition. In terms of comparing this to other Gothic novels, like classics like Dracula and Frankenstein, it's up there for me in terms of quality. In fact, if I was to do a top list, this would definitely be on that list. This novel has some shocking twists and some great characters. Lewis also uses the monk to commentate on things like the hypocrisy of the Christian Church. While that's a topic that might not seem so controversial now, it certainly was one back in its day in the 1700s. He also does this in some really clever ways. One example that I can think of is where you have a scene with Ambrosio condemning a pregnant nun who comes to him for help. He condemns her and, just says, "You're a terrible sinner, get away from me," and allows her to be punished by the nuns. And then in the very next scene, he is then himself tempted by Matilda. I think that clever juxtaposition there of moral piety one minute and then corruption the next minute perfectly captures the kinds of things that we think about when we discuss things like the hypocrisy of the church, and even religion more generally. In terms of character, I think this has some of the most detailed and interesting characters of any Gothic novel. The character of Matilda gives us a really great secondary antagonist. What makes Matilda an interesting villain is that her motivations remain complex and ambiguous all the way through the novel. Also, her character is constantly changing throughout the novel. At one moment she is madly in love with Ambrosio, the next moment she has this sort of cold detachment towards him that's still friendly, but not romantic. She also ranges from being incredibly dominant and overbearing to being incredibly submissive and meek. By the end of the novel, you just don't really know where her intentions ever were, and whether she ever had good intentions or whether they were just purely evil or selfishly motivated. What's most interesting about this novel is that Lewis wrote this when he was barely 20 years old, and in a very short span of time. To have a grasp of character and plot and intellectual commentary, and to be able to do all of those things in such a young age is just really inspiring and really impressive. The plot in particular is something that there are just so many threads, and by the end of the novel they all fall logically together, but at least when I was reading it I couldn't see where those pieces were going. And I think that's a skill that many great authors even struggle to get right every time. Okay, now we have my last item on this list, and that is Wuthering Heights, written by Emily Bronte in 1847. Wuthering Heights presents the tempestuous history of the denizens of the titular Heights, situated on the bleak Yorkshire moors. Recounted by the Wuthering Heights housekeeper Nellie, we hear of the intense relationship between gypsy foundling Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw, and of its tragic fallout, which leaves the future generation of Earnshaw's victims to the now wretched and cruel Heathcliff. Like many Gothic novels, Wuthering Heights explores some of the darker and crueler aspects of human nature. But unlike some Gothic novels, or a lot of Gothic novels, there are very few good people in this novel. Every character is deeply flawed and mostly terrible for most of the novel. Despite this, because we get basically the whole life story of a lot of these characters, we go from seeing them as somewhat innocent children to being the kind of cold, embittered people that they become. I remember speaking to a friend of mine who read this at school, and he said that he hated this book because the characters were so unlikable. But I think if you like those kinds of very, very flawed, tragic Gothic heroes, then this is definitely a book for you. What puts this on this particular list, though, is less about the characters and more about the atmosphere, because I think that Wuthering Heights has one of the best Gothic atmospheres in Gothic literature. The novel is set on the Yorkshire moors, which is a place where Emily Bronte lived, and it's quite a desolate place, especially in the winter, and I imagine even more so back then when she lived there. Emily Bronte herself was also known as a very reclusive individual. Both of these two things, her knowledge of the moors and her own psychology, play into the way the atmosphere of this novel is constructed. The moors feel completely isolated from anywhere else, and the coldness and the desolation of the setting is reflected really well in the characters, especially as they become more and more depressed and broken as the novel goes on. The fact that she can bring these three elements together, the characters, the setting, and the more general atmosphere, and have them all interlink with each other and connect, just kind of builds this overall sense of dread and isolation that only gets worse as the novel goes on. Wuthering Heights, then, is one of those Gothic novels that proves that you don't need massive amounts of blood, devils, monsters, and vampires to make a great Gothic novel. Okay guys, that's it for my list. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe if you want to see more in the future. Also, please let me know in the comments what are 5 great Gothic novels that you have read. I may have read them, I may have not, but if I haven't read them, I will read them, and they may find themselves on a future iteration of this list. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.